Good morning, everyone. Again, we say welcome to the TRC hearings. Today, our program will be in two phases. We have the individual hearings, and it will be followed by thematic or institutional hearings. So to start this morning, I will ask that we all stand and observe a few moments of silence. Thank you very much. Please be seated. Oh, sorry. I will ask you to please just stand less. Put your right hand up. Put your left here.
I, Kerper, Dwanyen, do promise that my testimony I have come to give to the TRC of Liberia is the truth and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Mr. Witness, good morning.
Good morning.
And a hearty welcome from us at the TRC. We are happy that you have come to share your experience and perspectives about our conflict with the TRC. As you know, this forum is meant to help us out of the tragedies of the past, the trauma, and the negative experiences, to understand how it has impacted our nation and people, to find the root causes of the conflict, and then advance recommendations that will help us secure a better future for posterity. So we are delighted and say thanks for coming. I will use this time to introduce commissioners, following which you will say a little about yourself and then move into your testimony. To your right is Commissioner Sheikh Afuma Kone, Per Brambu, Jara Coleman, Dede Dolope, Massa Washington, John Stewart, and Umu Sila. I'm Jerome Fuedia. Can we begin by restating your name for the record?
Kerper, Dwanyen.
Where are you currently residing?
I reside in Minnesota in Brooklyn Center.
Your current occupation?
I own a mortgage business.
Mortgage?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a bad business these days.
Yes. Sometimes they say it's better to be unemployed.
When did you migrate to the U.S.?
I first came to the U.S. in 1978.
First came. And when did you second come?
Well, I've always gone back and forth to
Okay.
Liberia during that.
But since 78, you took up
Yeah, I've been
permanent
there since
residence?
1978, yes.
Okay. Your date of birth, please.
June 10, 1959.
June 10.
Yeah, my birthday was on Tuesday.
A few days ago. Congratulations.
1049.
1949.
No, 59, 59.
59. Okay, sir. The stage is all yours.
Well, thank you. Before I begin, I just want to clarify something. If you read an article on NPR, they described some skepticism on my part to this process. I want to say that's completely not the case. The NPR reporter interviewed me as the leader of this community, and she asked about the community sentiments, how the community was anticipating this event. And just as I stated during the opening ceremonies, that there was a mix of reactions. And skepticism was one of those reactions, so it wasn't a personal reaction. I want to say that I've been deeply supportive of this effort. I was in Liberia in 2005, early 2005. I took my time to meet with Commissioner Coleman. That was when he was, the office was at the Public Works. I offered a hand of support, and I think what you're doing is very necessary for our country. My own preference would have been for something stronger, a war crimes tribunal. But this is what we have, and we are looking forward to supporting this and making sure that you succeed in your mission. So I just wanted to clear that air.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Without reservation, we appreciate it. And skepticism are not uncommon in this line of work. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. When I first became aware of the Comprehensive Peace Accord in Accra that led to the birth of this commission, and noted that you were mandated to review the period between 1979 and 2003, I thought that that was a major mistake, that that period only represents a symptom of a long-running conflict, which goes back to the beginning of our country. And if we are to truly understand the causes of our conflict, and as a result of that, reconcile ourselves to a better future, we have to take into account the entire picture. So I will begin by talking about the period prior to 1979 in our history. Then I will talk about the periods after 1979 and talk about the effects, what I know about those who orchestrated the war, how it impacted my family, how it's impacted me in the diaspora. I will talk about the Nimba Redemption Council, and then I'll offer some recommendations that I think will help us to move our country forward. Liberia, since its beginning, and I say that leaving out the period after 2005 because that's a chapter that is still being written. But from the beginning of Liberia, the management of the country was characterized by a political and economic hegemony in which those that founded the country came into a situation where prior to their arrival, all of the tribes in Liberia lived as a nation. They did not live in a cohesive country called Liberia. The Guilds lived as a nation, the Peles, the Mandingos, everybody had their own, ethnic structure. Then came in the settlers, and throughout the period of settler rule, you saw them manage the country in that same manner. They dominated the politics of the country. When I was growing up, there used to be this statement, it was probably a myth, maybe a reality, but in practice, that's what was said. It said behind the president's chair, it said, never forget the pioneers' children. That hegemony also dominated the economy of the country. And the development of Liberia was centered around Monrovia primarily, and the coastal cities that they occupied. And the settlers that ruled the country constituted about 5% of the population. And in order for 5% to rule 95%, there has to be a lot of tactics that can sometimes be distasteful. Those tactics, consisted of systemic, violations of the Constitution. Liberia was set up as a republic with 3 equal branches of government. But in my lifetime, those branches did not exhibit equality. The Senate and the House of Representatives were composed of people who were handpicked by the president so that they couldn't challenge his authority. The judiciary was subservient to the president. My father, I was listening to Dr. Wesley yesterday speaking about the first Gribble person that became a member of the House of Representatives from Maryland. As a child, I witnessed my father go through 3 elections where he won all of them. But Tubman and Talbot decided that that was not who they wanted. The saying was that the people of Nimba want you, but who do we want? And, the elections were fraudulent. And to support this structure, they formed a military which was not really groomed into a professional military. Starting with the Liberian Frontier Force, that army was basically a goon force to enforce their rule. And the soldiers their mantra was, government gave me a gun, they didn't give me English. In Liberian language, they said, government gave me a gun, don't give me English. Meaning, don't try to engage me in dialogue. That's not why I'm here. I have a gun, you do what I say. And that was the manifestation of the dictatorship. And part of their tactics in tax collections, they would go into the village, grab the chief, and demand that everybody pay their tax. If you didn't pay, they made you to lay in the sun with your face, facing the sun, and if you didn't pay, you stay there. And so the brutality, the systematic brutality of the Liberian army, and we saw that throughout the years, created a culture of violence where the idea that a soldier is a gentleman is foreign to Liberia. And as you can see, and we'll talk about this later, when the young men and women took up arms to fight against the government at the time, they simply exhibited the programming that they had been conditioned to. And the roots of this behavior has to go back to how the government socialized and indoctrinated the military that was supposed to serve and protect. Because of all these abuses, at the time I was coming of age in high school, Talbot had come to power. He promised total involvement in an open society. Students had begun to challenge the system. I was one of those. John Stewart here, we were at the university, and we were clamoring for change because we thought that, we read the books about democracy and we believed it. And we thought that it should come to our country. What we were advocating for was multi-party democracy, respect for the rule of law, and respect for human rights, and equitable distribution of the resources of the country. We are now blamed in some quarters as the ones who brought about this crisis. What we did was to challenge a system that was deeply inequitable. No one in the student movement, no one in the progressive movement anticipated or encouraged or asked the military to go in and kill the president. That was not a part of the plans that we had. That was not what we were advocating for. That was a derailment of the struggle for justice and equality that we were a part of. The wave of multi-party democracy that you see across Africa today started in Liberia when I was a student advocating for that. Talbot did a lot to try to bring about change. But then he also became a tragic figure because he got torn between serving the proverbial two masters. While he saw the injustices of the system and wanted to bring change, he was unable to persuade the old guard of the Truic Party, the conservative guard, to go along with his change. And because he did not impose that change, we saw a situation that created mistrust, a political vacuum that was exploited by the military. I listened to the former VP, Benny Warner, when he spoke about the fact that how he was selected as vice president. And he noted that Jackson Doe was on the short list. Jackson Doe was a close friend of my father. At the time of his consideration, we knew that he had been considered to be the vice president. According to the story, President Talbot had called in Richard Henrys and said, I want to make Jackson Doe vice president. At that time, Mac DeShield was out of the country, who was the Grand Master of the Masons, and that secret society that governed Liberia behind, the walls of the Masonic Temple. So Richard Henrys said to him, well, let Mac come back, then we'll talk. And when Mac came back, what we heard is that they went to Talbot, because those were the two old guards that in cahoots with each other, they felt powerful. So what do you want to do? You want to throw the country away and give it to the country people? It was my first time listening to former Vice President Warner to know that he was a Bassa man. In those days, he had the character, the identity that self-promoted as an American Liberian. And we saw that this glass ceiling was going to remain there, and it caused a lot of mistrust for Talbot. Because on the one hand, he's advocating change, but on the other hand, he's perpetuating this system that we all deeply resented. And as a result, he lost the trust of the people, and the 1979 rice riot was actually very sound economic policy, but because he had lost the trust of the people, you had the children of rice farmers who stood to benefit from that policy, rioting against it, demonstrating against it, because they had been persuaded that this was in Talbot's self-interest as a rice dealer, as opposed to in the national interest. So, these conditions brought about this vacuum that the military stepped in and took over. Now, one thing I want to talk about this military situation is that I don't believe for 1 minute that Samuel Doe and Wesson and Kuyompa and the rest of them had the means and the capacity to plan and execute that coup. So it is your task also to try to dig deeper to find out who was really behind this coup, who was intended to be president of Liberia. We've heard that Major Jebo was their commander, and somehow they got dislocated because what I've heard is that there were two groups of soldiers deployed that night. Since Talbot regularly slept in Bentall, that's where they expected him. Jebo led the group that was waiting in ambush on the Bentall Highway, and Doe and Kuyompa and the rest of them were stationed to attack the mansion as Plan B. I've also heard that they never went to the mansion with any arms, that they had inside help, where the late Ramase was in charge of the armory and distributed the weapons to them, which they used to carry out the assault. During the years of the military, the abuses became, it multiplied. I can't put a numerical quantification to it, but it was seriously exacerbated. They killed each other at random. They killed civilians. There was a lot of summary executions. The military had promised to turn the country over in 1985. But a few years into their rule, people began to encourage Samuel Doe to perpetuate himself, that if you leave power, you will be killed. And that was the genesis of the conflict between Doe and Kwironkwa. I've heard people characterize this as a Gio-Mano versus Crown conflict. That is incorrect. The Gio-Mano component of it is another symptom, which I'll get into a little bit here, but there was a philosophical difference between Doe and Kwironkwa. Kwironkwa thought that the soldiers should honor their promise and turn over power. And Doe wanted to perpetuate himself in power. So people began to take sides. And as a part of our social fabric, which comes from this situation of the tribes living as nations, the ethnicity began to manifest itself where the Gios and Manos began to support Kwironkwa, and the Crown began to support Doe. But it wasn't just 100%. There were Crowns who were supporting Kwironkwa, and there were Gios and Manos who were supporting Doe. But by and large, that's how the ethnic groups began to take sides behind these two powers in the TRC. Doe eventually won out in that conflict, but as part of what was happening, he began to systematically target the people of Nimba. And we've seen this memo that was leaked to the press by John Ramsey that he had to eliminate the people of Nimba if he was to remain in power. And he began to execute that plan. In 1983, Samuel Doe went up to Yekepat, and this is one of the most diabolical figures in this whole situation. And for some reason, they claim he went to rob the bank in Yekepat to get money. Yekepat is in Nimba, to get money to carry out the coup. But they wound up at the home of Charles Julu, killing his son and his driver. Doe reacted to that with swift violence. Doe had fled across the border, but he went and started to kill innocent, his soldiers went and started to kill innocent people in the country, and it deepened the conflict. And then we saw in 1985, Doe actually eventually ran for president, and he declared himself a winner. But I have to say that election was a fraud. That was not the election, that was not the multi-party democracy that I and others advocated for in the 70s. The election was characterized by the banning of political parties, by intimidation, and outright fraud when in the midst of counting the ballots, they changed the elections commission and created a new commission to count the ballots. Bags of ballots were burned. They were strewn across the highways, and Doe declared himself winner by 50.3%, just enough to avoid a runoff. That was a very frustrating moment in our own quest for democracy. Kwironkwa took the opportunity then to come and stage a coup, which failed. In the aftermath of that, the soldiers went to Nimba County again and created even more terror. And this is sad because this idea of guilt by association has dragged our country down the drain. Instead of holding individuals accountable for their behavior, we hold the ethnic groups and the associates responsible for their behavior when they know nothing about it. And this has been done by all parties. It's been done by all parties, and it's been a very tragic situation for our country. And so then, because of the violence, because of the egregious abuses of human rights, a lot of Liberians fled the country. They were of all ethnic groups. At that time, people began to think that, all right, the only way Doe is going to leave power is by violence. And a number of forces came together, to bring about the civil war that we saw